This is a very important claim. An ex-NASA scientist says most space flights were followed by space vehicles of extraterrestrial origin. This is by Steve McCamley, Collective Spark. His name is Maurice Chatelain. If you look him up on Google, you may not find much. IMDb states that he is usually identified as, quote, former NASA chief of communications, unquote, especially by ufologists. Other sources claim he was merely a low-level engineer who worked for a NASA subcontractor. Many refer to him as being the man responsible for building NASA's communication systems. His book, titled Our Ancestors Came from Outer Space, is a good place to find a description of his life and what he's experienced. And from here, a researcher would go about looking for confirmations outside of his own claims. Chatelain's details about his career and his designs that he mentioned in his book can be found online, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Let's just also keep in mind recently, having to do with the UFOs of the USS Nimitz, the UFO Tic Tac encounter, that the Department of Defense says claims and confirms are, in fact, UFOs that were spotted off the west coast of San Diego in 2004 and 2015. Now, going back to this, the famous Leonard Nimoy featured Chatelain in one of his documentaries regarding ancient aliens decades ago. He also verified his background, which has been done by many, by introducing him as a NASA space scientist who helped man reach the moon. The film features other prominent minds and academics at the time. Chatelain is also referenced by many prominent UFO researchers, and Chatelain also made many TV appearances. He seems to be well known. Now, Chatelain was a telecommunications, telemetry, and communications electronic specialist, and during his time, perhaps the best in the world at what he did. After he moved to America from Europe decades ago, he spent the next 20 years of his life working for a number of aerospace organizations and industries, and was also supported by the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Air Force, and NASA. He was even reimbursed by the United States government for the cost of moving his family to the United States. In his book, he details his various patents and designs for the companies that he worked for and the organizations his designs attracted. And you can visit a list of his patents here in the link. As you can see, there are just a few of his many contributions to the field. In his book, he goes on to explain in great detail how through his work and his connections, he was immediately offered the task of designing and building the Apollo communication and data processing system. He also explains how nobody specified his duties or functions because no one at the time knew what these systems would be like. There were very few experts in the field, and Chatelain was in charge of all that he mentions below. Quote, when the Apollo project started, there was no communications equipment powerful enough or sensitive enough to make voice transmission possible from Earth to the moon, not to mention transmission of television pictures over that distance. Such things had to be invented, perfected, and built. Relay stations had to be installed all around the globe in the tropics with parabolic dish antennas, some over 200 feet in diameter, in such a way that one or two of them would always be in contact with the Apollo spacecraft orbiting around the moon. All these stations had to be in contact with each other, and all of them had to report to the Apollo Space Flight Center in Houston, Texas. All the new equipment built by some 20 different suppliers from all parts of the United States had to be coordinated and made compatible. It's interesting to think about these things. When contemplating the Apollo missions, it's not often we think about the tremendous amount of work that went into it by so many men and women. Many of them, like Chatelain, go practically unknown, as the focus is always on the astronauts, who themselves have also been quite outspoken and have collaborated Chatelain's disclosures. He was also featured in what appears to be a French talk show found on YouTube. So what did Chatelain have to say in his book regarding the Apollo missions? Quote, during these missions, several strange things happened. Some still cannot be talked about, and some I will mention without revealing my sources of information and with the utmost reserve because I personally was not there when these incidents allegedly took place. It could be, for example, that both the American and the Russian space programs did bring back discoveries that were not anticipated, end quote. He goes on to state that most of the astronauts saw strange things during their missions that could not be discussed with anybody outside of NASA. Obviously, since that time of Chatelaine, there are so many astronauts that have spoken out about what they saw and what they know. It seems that a large percentage of the Apollo astronauts have all made such comments. Apollo 14, Dr. Edgar Mitchell, expressed that he had known of extraterrestrial visitations and that there have been crashed craft and bodies recovered, quote unquote. Gordon Cooper, part of the very first manned mission to space, said the same thing. Dr. Brian O'Leary is another who admitted that there being abundant evidence, quote unquote, existing for the fact that we are being contacted. Story, Musgrave, another Apollo 12 astronaut, Al Worden, shared his thoughts on the matter not long ago. He stated his belief that our ancestors came from outer space. It's funny because that's the title of Chatelaine's book, and the list does not end there, but I'll stop. It's not just astronauts, it's scientists from within these organizations as well, like Dr. John Brandenburg, the deputy manager of the Clementine mission to the moon, and Norman Berggren, the veteran Ames research scientist and a key member of the Voyager missions. And I recently wrote an article about Berggren and what he has exposed, and you can read more about that here in the link. And it shows a picture of a giant UFO hovering just outside Saturn's outer ring. Chatelaine goes on to write, "It's very difficult to obtain any specific information from NASA, which still exercises a very strict control over any disclosure of these events. It seems that all Apollo and Gemini flights were followed both at a distance and sometimes also quite closely by space vehicles of extraterrestrial origin, flying saucers or UFOs identified the Apollo spacecraft VJ flying objects, if you want to call them by that name. Every time it occurred, the astronauts informed mission control, who then ordered absolute silence." He provides specific examples of that, what he's aware of. Quote, "The following year, on November 12, 1966, James Lovell and Edwin Aldrin in Gemini 12 also saw two UFOs at slightly over half a mile from the capsule. These were observed for quite some time and photographed repeatedly. The same happened to Frank Borman and James Lovell in Apollo 8 on Christmas Eve in 1968, and to Thomas Stafford and John Young aboard Apollo 10 on May 22, 1969. The UFOs showed up both during the orbit around the moon and on the homeward flight of Apollo 10. End quote. And here's a picture from ex-command Sergeant Major Bob Dean, who is friends with Berggren, mentioned above. He supposedly obtained some pictures that NASA had locked away, and it comes from this lecture. Corroboration. Having been an avid researcher in the field for quite some time, I'm sure many others will tell you this. It's not uncommon at all to come across similarities in stories that intersect among multiple credible sources. For example, in his book, Chatelaine also mentions nuclear weapons testing on the moon. Quote, "There was even some talk that the Apollo 13 mission carried a nuclear device aboard that could be set off to make measurements of the infrastructure of the moon, and whose detonations would show on the charts of several recording seismographs, 18 placed in different locations. The unexplained explosions of an oxygen tank in the service module of Apollo 13 on its flight to the moon, according to rumors, was caused deliberately by a UFO that was following the capsule to prevent the detonation of the atomic charge that would possibly have destroyed or endangered some moon base established by extraterrestrials. Well, there was a lot of talk, and there still is," end quote. This is interesting because decades after Chatelaine wrote his book, Colonel Lorrin Ross Dietrichson, assigned to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, between 1950 and 58, which included contract administration duties at Nevada test sites, Pacific Nuclear Test Area west of Hawaii, nuclear weapon manufacturing and quality assurance in Albuquerque, and inspection of nuclear and non-nuclear facilities throughout the country. He stated the same thing, that we tried to send a nuclear weapon to the moon, and he also referenced Apollo 13. Quote, a spacecraft went to the rescue of Apollo 13, and they accompanied Apollo 13 on their Voyager on the moon back to Earth, and on 2 occasions they thought they might have to transfer the crew to their spacecraft, but they saw them safely back to Earth, end quote. And he also stated, quote, I also learned about incidents involving nuclear weapons, and among these incidents were a couple of nuclear weapons sent into space who were destroyed by the extraterrestrials. At the very end of the 70s and the early 80s, we attempted to put a nuclear weapon on the moon and explode it for scientific measurements and other things, which was not acceptable to the extraterrestrials. They destroyed the weapon before it got to the moon, end quote. Is there any documentation to support these claims? Yes, a declassified report by the Air Force Nuclear Weapons Center from June 1959 shows just how seriously they considered the plan called Project A-119. In general, they wanted to investigate the capability of weapons in space, as well as gain further insight into the space environment and the detonation of nuclear devices within it. It seems that they did, and obviously the public would not know what the U.S. is talking, that the U.S. is taking a nuclear weapon to space. It would be classified. The UFOs and nuclear weapons go hand in hand. That's another topic in itself, which you can read in the link here. Chatelain also describes extraterrestrial encounters of the moon and code words used to describe extraterrestrial spacecraft like Santa Claus. He is not the only insider to do so. The takeaway is to really recognize just how much witness testimony we've had to come out over the decades from credible sources. Furthermore, it's 2020. We now have physical evidence, electro-optical data, and radar tracking to go along with it. We know we are not alone, and it's stories like these that have been wrongfully kept from humanity. Transparency, exploration, discovery, and truth is not something which should be denied to the human race. It's our birthright. It's hard to tell what's going on sometimes, but at the end of the day, it's quite clear that something is. This is a topic where one must remain skeptical, especially of mainstream media and the way they do and cover it. The truth is out there. Now, this article, ex-NASA scientists, most space flights were followed by space vehicles of extraterrestrial origin, was originally created for collective evolution, and is published here under Creative Commons. This is by Steve McCamley on Collective Spark. Please leave your comments. What do you think? If you'd like to join me on my Patreon account, you will hear content not covered by mainstream media. These riveting stories will be based on my research, and I will state my opinions and give my personal insight on diverse and controversial subjects and world events not covered by mainstream media, and not supported by YouTube guidelines. So whatever I have on my Patreon, most of those will not be on my YouTube channel. Please consider becoming a member today. More of the most significant and important videos will be on my Patreon channel. Your support helps me to continue my research and keeps this YouTube channel alive. And we depend on your support, your generous charity, because we help economically challenged families here in Athens, Greece, in Kapota, and we also help the young generation with university tuition and the community around our church. Thank you.